The air in the main dining room of the Elysian Grand was not merely conditioned, it was curated. It smelled of old money and white truffles, a carefully balanced aroma designed to soothe the egos of the titans who dined within its gilded walls. Crystal chandeliers, vast and intricate as frozen constellations, hung from the vaulted ceiling, their light refracting through 1,000 prisms to cast a soft, forgiving glow upon the room. Each ray of light seemed to land with purpose, glinting off the polished silver cutlery that rested on starched linen tablecloths, each one a small island of pristine white in a sea of deep mahogany and hushed, powerful conversations. The sound of the room was a symphony of wealth, the delicate, almost musical clinking of silverware against fine porcelain, the soft murmur of voices discussing billion-dollar mergers and political stratagems, the near silent footsteps of the staff as they moved with an ethereal grace between tables. This was more than a restaurant, it was a sanctuary for the world's elite, a fortress of opulence where the harsh realities of the outside world were not permitted to intrude. The very silence was heavy, woven with the unspoken understanding that everyone present was a player in a game far too complex for ordinary people to comprehend. Among them, Akari Tanaka moved like a ghost, a study in professional invisibility. Her uniform was simple, a stark black and white that served as camouflage against the room's extravagant backdrop. Her movements were precise, efficient, and utterly devoid of wasted energy, a ballet of service honed through countless hours of observation and practice. When she refilled a water glass, her hand was so steady that not a single ripple disturbed the surface. When she cleared a plate, it vanished from the table as if by magic. To the patrons, she was less a person and more an extension of the room's flawless service, a pair of hands, a polite nod, an entity that existed only to anticipate their needs before they were even consciously formed. She kept her gaze respectfully lowered, her expression a perfect mask of pleasant neutrality. This carefully constructed persona of a competent but unremarkable waitress was her shield and her greatest weapon, a cloak of anonymity she had spent years perfecting. No one would ever suspect the storm of calculation and resolve that raged behind her calm, dark eyes, nor the purpose that had brought her to this specific place at this specific time. Inside her mind, however, a completely different world existed, one forged in the fires of loss and injustice. Akari was not just a waitress. She was a graduate of the Wharton School of Business, a prodigy of corporate finance who could read a balance sheet like a poet reads verse. This hotel, the Elysian Grand, was not just her workplace. It was the flagship of an empire her father, Kenji Tanaka, had built from a single inn into a global symbol of hospitality. He had built it upon the sacred principle of omotenashi, a philosophy of wholehearted, selfless service. But 10 years ago, that empire had been stolen in a brutal, merciless, hostile takeover, orchestrated by an American private equity firm. She could still see her father's face from that time, the light slowly dimming in his eyes, as the company that was his life's work, his very soul, was ripped away. The stress had shattered his health, leading to a fatal heart attack that left a teenage Akari with nothing but a legacy in ashes and a burning, all-consuming need for justice. For a decade she had channeled that grief, meticulously using her financial genius to quietly buy back controlling shares of the company's stock, transforming her inheritance of pain into a weapon of financial power. She was now the silent, majority owner, a queen disguised as a pawn in her own castle. The delicate equilibrium of the dining room was shattered by the arrival of one man. Marcus Thorne did not simply enter a room, he conquered it. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and ambition, his tailored suit, a piece of armor, his $1,000 shoes weapons that struck the marble floor with disdainful clicks. The maître d' practically genuflected as he led Thorne and his guest, a potential Japanese investor, to the best table in the house. Thorne's presence sucked the warmth from the air, replacing it with a palpable chill of ruthless authority. He waved a hand dismissively at the chair held for him. a gesture that communicated more contempt than 1,000 words. He surveyed the room not with appreciation, but with the cold, appraising gaze of a predator scanning his territory. To him, the staff were not people, they were components in a machine, and he was its undisputed master. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept past Akari without a flicker of recognition. She was just another cog, invisible and insignificant, and that was precisely how he saw the world, a collection of assets and obstacles, all to be managed or crushed beneath the heel of his ambition. Seated at his table, Thorne began his performance, his voice a low growl of calculated condescension designed to impress his guest. He leaned in, a conspiratorial smirk playing on his lips. "This place still has the ghost of the old man in its walls," he said to the investor, loud enough for the nearby staff to hear. "Kenji Tanaka. He built this chain on some soft, inefficient nonsense he called komotenashi. Wholehearted hospitality. Can you believe it? I believe in a different spirit, profit. It's the only language that matters." Akari, standing perfectly still at her station a few feet away, felt the words land like physical blows. Each syllable was a desecration of her father's memory, a mockery of the very principles that had once made the Tanaka Hospitality Group a beacon of honor in the corporate world. A cold fury solidified in her veins, not hot and reckless but icy and controlled. Her hands, holding a silver tray, remained perfectly steady. Her breathing became slow, deliberate. He was not just a CEO. He was the architect of her family's ruin, the man who had built his throne upon her father's grave, and he had no idea he was speaking to the ghost he so casually mocked. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into the confrontation that will change everything, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. The stage is set in the heart of New York City, but we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed and have joined our community, because you are about to witness an incredible display of resilience and righteous power that you will not soon forget. The moment of reckoning is fast approaching, and every detail matters in this intricate game of legacy and revenge. Thorne then leaned back, a cruel glint in his eye, and decided to put on a show. It was a power play he enjoyed, a little test to demonstrate the staff's incompetence and, by extension, his own superiority. He began speaking in loud, intentionally complex Japanese, pretending to be a lost and confused tourist in his own flagship hotel. His accent was passable, but his grammar was clumsy, littered with the subtle errors of someone who had learned the language from a textbook rather than from the heart. He gestured wildly, asking for directions to a non-existent suite, his voice laced with feigned panic. One by one, the senior staff members approached, their faces etched with anxiety. The concierge, a man fluent in 5 languages, was flustered by the sheer arrogance of the display. He bowed deeply, apologizing in perfect English. The floor manager followed, offering assistance, also in English. They were professionals, trained to de-escalate, but they were unprepared for a CEO who treated his own employees like actors in a humiliating play. With each failed attempt by his staff, Thorne's smirk widened. He turned to his investor, a look of vindicated disgust on his face. "You see?" he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "All surface, no substance." The old man Tanaka was the same. A lot of bowing and pretty words, but no real backbone, no killer instinct. He let the insult hang in the air, a poisoned dart aimed at the memory of a man he had destroyed. It was then that Akari felt the last vestiges of her patient facade begin to crack. That single sentence, so casual and so cruel, echoed the headlines from a decade ago, the whispers in the boardroom that had broken her father's spirit. The image of her father's slumped shoulders, the look of utter defeat in his eyes during his final days, flashed through her mind. This wasn't business for Thorne. It was a victory he savored every day. And for Akari, this was no longer a mission for justice. It had just become deeply, irrevocably personal. The silent fury in her core now had a singular focus, a clear and undeniable target. His cruel game not yet finished, Thorne's cold eyes finally scanned the room and settled on the quietest, most unassuming target he could find, Akari. He saw her simple uniform, her respectfully lowered gaze, and saw the perfect final piece for his performance of dominance. He didn't call her name. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, insulting sound that cut through the hushed ambiance of the dining room. Several patrons turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the blatant display of disrespect. Akari's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the icy calm that was settling over her. She raised her head slowly, her expression still a mask of professional neutrality, and met his gaze. He gestured for her to approach with a flick of his wrist, as one might summon a dog. Then, in his flawed but arrogant Japanese, he unleashed the final insult, a condescending question designed to be utterly demeaning. Assuming she was just another clueless employee he could crush for sport, he leaned forward and asked, "Little girl, do you even know whose name is on the building you work in?" The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. For a single, drawn-out second, the world seemed to freeze. The clinking of silverware stopped. The low hum of powerful conversations died away. Every eye in the Elysian Grand's dining room was fixed on the small, unassuming waitress and the corporate titan who was attempting to crush her. Akari didn't move. She simply stood there, absorbing the insult, letting it wash over her not as a wave of shame, but as the final piece of data she needed. Inside her, the image of her father's face, pale and defeated in a hospital bed, sharpened into crystalline focus. The hum of the life support machine echoed in her memory, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her grief. Thorne's question, "Do you even know whose name is on the building you work in?" was not just an insult to her. It was a final posthumous spit on her father's grave. And in that moment, something shifted deep within her soul. The 10 years of patient, silent, meticulous planning, the years of living a double life, of suppressing her own identity, all coalesced into a single point of unassailable certainty. The ghost he had mocked was about to speak, the waitress was about to vanish, and in her place, a queen would rise. Her posture changed first. It was a subtle transformation, but for those watching, it was as dramatic as a curtain rising on a stage. Her shoulders, which had been held in a posture of deferential service, straightened and squared, her spine elongated, adding an inch to her height. She lifted her chin, no longer the servant with a lowered gaze, but a peer meeting an equal. Her eyes, which had been carefully veiled, now met his directly, and the neutral mask she wore dissolved, revealing an intelligence so sharp and a focus so intense it was unnerving. The air around her seemed to crackle with a newfound energy, an authority that was utterly at odds with her simple uniform. She took a slow, deliberate breath, not of nervousness, but of control, centering herself for the verbal strike she was about to deliver. It was a transformation so complete that Marcus Thorne, for the first time, felt a flicker of unease, a primal instinct that the prey he had cornered was not what it seemed. The room watched, utterly captivated, sensing that they were about to witness something far more significant than a boss berating an employee. Then, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent room with the clarity of a bell. She answered him in Japanese, but it was a form of the language so profoundly different from his clumsy attempt that it was like comparing a child's crayon drawing to a master's calligraphy. She used flawless, deeply respectful Kigo, the honorific speech of the imperial court and the highest echelons of business, a language of intricate layers and profound cultural weight. "Son-sama," she began, her tone impossibly formal, using a title of utmost respect that, in this context, was a subtle mockery of his boorishness. "この建物だけでなく、この建物が礎となっている帝国全体が私の父、田中健二のビジョンによって築かれたものであることを Watashi wa kata toki mo wasureta koto wa gozaimasen. Thorn-sama, I have never for a moment forgotten that not only this building but the entire empire, of which it is the cornerstone, was built upon the vision of my father, Kenji Tanaka. The words were a quiet storm, each syllable a perfectly polished stone of defiance. The Japanese investor's eyes widened in stunned recognition of her linguistic mastery. He understood instantly that this was not a waitress. This was someone of immense stature and breeding. Thorn was left utterly speechless. His mind, so quick to calculate profit margins and hostile takeover strategies, struggled to process what was happening. He understood the words, but the context was impossible. The sheer unadulterated fluency, the perfect pitch and honorifics, were beyond anything he could have imagined. It was as if a janitor had suddenly started quoting Shakespeare in perfect iambic pentameter. His brain short-circuited. He had expected tears, or a stammered apology, or frightened silence. He had not expected this display of linguistic and cultural superiority from a woman in a server's uniform. He could only stare, his mouth slightly agape, the condescending smirk frozen on his face now looking utterly foolish. A slow, dark red flush began to creep up his neck, a physical manifestation of his humiliation. He had intended to make an example of her, to demonstrate his power. Instead, in front of a crucial investor, she had effortlessly, quietly, and completely dismantled his facade of worldly sophistication. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with a few, perfectly chosen words. Akari let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer, allowing his embarrassment to marinate in the thick, judgmental quiet of the dining room. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, she switched to perfect, unaccented English, her voice now cool and sharp as a shard of ice. "Your accent is quite good, Mr. Thorn," she said, her tone level and devoid of emotion, which only made the words cut deeper. For an amateur, the insult was delivered with such calm authority that it resonated like a physical slap. The investor he was trying to impress let out a small, almost imperceptible gasp. He looked from Akari to Thorn, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning contempt. He had been brought here to witness a display of power and competence. Instead, he was watching his host be intellectually and culturally disemboweled by a waitress. The carefully constructed world of Marcus Thorn, built on a foundation of arrogance and intimidation, was beginning to crumble around him, and it was all happening in the heart of his own empire, under the light of his own crystal chandeliers. The flush on Thorn's neck deepened to a furious crimson. The shock gave way to a wave of pure, unadulterated rage. His entire career had been built on the principle of control, of never being made to look weak. He saw her not as a person, but as a malfunction, an intolerable error in his perfectly managed system that needed to be deleted immediately. His face twisted into a mask of fury, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Who do you think you are?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that abandoned all pretense of civility. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the marble floor, a sound of pure aggression in the otherwise silent room. "You're a nobody. You serve water. You clear plates." He pointed a trembling finger at her. "You are fired! Get out of my sight! Get out of my building!" The words were spat out, a desperate attempt to reassert his dominance, to put her back in the box he had created for her. He needed to erase her, to nullify the humiliation she had just inflicted upon him. Akari did not flinch. She did not react at all to his outburst, save for the faintest hint of a smile that touched the corners of her lips. It was a calm, knowing smile that infuriated him even further. It was the smile of someone who held all the cards, who had anticipated this very move. She let his words echo in the room, let his tantrum be witnessed by every powerful person present. Then she spoke again, her voice still calm, but now carrying a clear, resonant note of finality that commanded the attention of everyone. "That's an interesting assertion, Mr. Thorn," she said, her gaze unwavering, "because this little performance of yours, this test for the staff, was actually my final interview for your position. The statement was so audacious, so utterly unbelievable, that a collective murmur rippled through the dining room. Thorne stared at her, his rage momentarily replaced by sheer, dumbfounded confusion. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was none. The world had tilted on its axis, and he was losing his balance. With a grace that was almost hypnotic, Akari reached into a small, hidden pocket of her apron. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each one designed to heighten the drama of the moment. She produced a small, elegant business card, held between her thumb and forefinger. The cardstock was thick and expensive, a stark white rectangle that seemed to glow in the soft light of the restaurant. She leaned forward slightly, not in deference but in command, and placed the card gently on the polished mahogany table, directly in front of Thorne's wine glass. It made a soft, definitive sound as it landed. The card was simple, printed in a clean, minimalist font. It contained only 3 lines of text, but those 3 lines were enough to detonate the rest of Marcus Thorne's life. He stared down at it, his eyes struggling to comprehend the words, his brain refusing to accept the reality they represented. The room was so quiet you could hear the frantic, panicked beating of his own heart. The card read, Akari Tanaka, chairwoman and majority shareholder, Tanaka Hospitality Group. The name, her name, hit him like a physical force. Tanaka, the ghost he had mocked, the old man he had destroyed. It couldn't be. He looked up from the card to her face, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the faint resemblance in the set of her jaw, the same determined light in her eyes that he had seen in Kenji Tanaka's, just before he had crushed him. The realization crashed down upon him not in a wave, but in a devastating, soul-shattering tsunami. This wasn't just some random insubordinate employee. This was the daughter. The heir. The architect of a revenge 10 years in the making. Every ounce of color drained from his face, leaving him with a pasty, sickly pallor. The rage, the arrogance, the confidence, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He had been so busy gloating on the throne he had never once thought to check for the rightful heir approaching from the shadows. Akari stood to her full height, her presence now utterly dominating the space around her. She was no longer a waitress. She was the embodiment of a legacy he had tried to erase. "My father," she said, her voice now imbued with the weight of a decade of grief and resolve, "built this company on the principle of respect, a value you wouldn't recognize if it was printed on your balance sheets." She paused, letting the indictment settle. "You see, you didn't just orchestrate a hostile takeover, Mr. Thorne. You didn't just steal his company. You took his life. The stress of your victory put him in an early grave." Her eyes bore into his, and for the first time he saw not just anger, but a profound and bottomless sorrow that had been forged into a weapon of unbreakable steel. "I have spent the last 10 years of my life, every single day, working towards this exact moment. I made sure that I would be the one to personally show you the door." The Japanese investor, who had been watching this entire exchange with a look of horrified fascination, slowly pushed his chair back. He looked at Thorne with an expression of utter disgust. The man he had been considering investing hundreds of millions of dollars with was not a ruthless genius. He was a petty, cruel fool who had been outmaneuvered by the very legacy he despised. The investor then turned his gaze to Akari, and his expression shifted to one of deep, profound respect. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow of his head, a gesture of acknowledgement from one power player to another. "Miss Tanaka," he said, his voice clear and formal, cutting through the tension, "I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss. It seems my potential partnership was with the wrong leadership all along." The words were a death sentence for Thorne's career. He had not only lost his job, he had lost his credibility, his reputation, and his future, all in the space of 5 catastrophic minutes. Security guards, alerted by the floor manager, began to approach the table, their movements discreet but purposeful. They were waiting for a signal. Thorne looked around the room, at the faces of the patrons staring at him, their expressions ranging from pity to contempt. He saw the investor turning away from him, already dismissing him from existence. He saw his senior staff, the very people he had terrorized for years, now looking at him with a cold, detached satisfaction. There was no escape. He was trapped in the wreckage of his own hubris. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, to threaten, but no words came out. What could he say? He had been so thoroughly, so completely defeated. Akari gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the head of security. It was time. The reign of Marcus Thorne was officially over. His empire had crumbled, not from a market crash or a corporate raid, but from the quiet, unyielding power of a daughter's love for her father. As the guards moved to escort a pale and trembling Marcus Thorne from the dining room, a strange sense of calm settled over Akari. For 10 years, this moment had been a blazing fire in her mind, a fantasy of righteous fury and triumphant revenge. But now that it was here, it felt different. It was not the hot, exhilarating thrill of victory she had expected, but a quiet, solemn sense of closure. It was the feeling of a heavy weight, one she had carried for a decade, finally being lifted from her shoulders. She watched him being led away, a pathetic, deflated figure stripped of his power and prestige, and she felt not hatred, but a profound and final emptiness. The mission that had consumed her entire adult life was complete. She had avenged her father. She had reclaimed her family's name. But as the doors of the restaurant swung shut behind Thorne, a new, daunting question began to form in her mind. What comes next? The ghost of her past had been exorcised, but the future was now a vast, uncharted territory. She walked away from the table, ignoring the stunned whispers and stares of the patrons. She moved through the restaurant, her steps steady and sure, and headed for the staff exit. As she pushed through the swinging doors into the stark, fluorescent-lit reality of the kitchen, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion. She leaned against a cool, stainless steel counter, the sounds of the kitchen, the clatter of pans, the hiss of the grill, the shouts of the chefs, fading into a dull roar in her ears. For the first time in a decade, she was no longer a warrior with a singular purpose. She was just Akari Tanaka, the new owner of a global empire, standing alone in a kitchen, still wearing the uniform of a waitress. The sheer scale of what she had just done, and what lay ahead of her, washed over her, and for a moment she felt a flicker of the same fear and uncertainty that had plagued her as a teenager standing at her father's grave. She made her way out of the hotel through a back alley, pulling off her apron and stuffing it into a nearby bin. The cool night air of New York City felt like a balm on her skin. She walked for blocks without any destination in mind, the city lights blurring into long streaks of color. The dual identities she had maintained for so long were now gone. There was no more waitress, no more silent avenger, there was only her. The weight of her new title, chairwoman, felt impossibly heavy. She had mastered the art of tearing down. Now she had to learn the art of building up. Her father's legacy was not just about reclaiming the company, it was about restoring its soul, about rebuilding it on the principles of *omotenashi* that Thorne had so viciously mocked. It was a task that felt even more daunting than her quest for revenge. She found herself standing on a bridge, looking down at the dark, swirling water below, feeling utterly and completely alone with the ghost of her own success. It was in that moment of quiet desperation that her resolve began to solidify once more. The fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a familiar flame of determination. This wasn't the end of her journey, it was the true beginning. Reclaiming the company had been for her father. Rebuilding it would be for herself, and for every employee who had suffered under Thorne's tyrannical reign. She took out her phone, her fingers moving with renewed purpose. She scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't called in years. David Chen. He had been a close friend of her father's, a veteran investigative journalist who had been forced into early retirement after he started asking too many questions about the suspicious nature of the Tanaka Hospitality Group's takeover. He had always believed there was more to the story, that the official reports hid a deeper, darker truth. He was the one person who had never dismissed her father's ruin as a simple case of bad business. She pressed the call button, her heart pounding a steady rhythm of newfound purpose. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Chen. He sounded older, more tired than she remembered. David, she said, her own voice sounding strange to her ears, no longer the whisper of a waitress or the command of a chairwoman, but simply the voice of Akari Tanaka. It's Akari, Kenji Tanaka's daughter. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long silence. She could picture him perfectly, sitting in his cluttered apartment, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and cold cups of coffee, a man who had been sidelined by the very corruption he had fought to expose. He had been one of the few who had attended her father's funeral, his face a mask of quiet, impotent rage. He had been a casualty of Thorne's rise to power, just as her family had been. Akari, he finally said, his voice thick with a mixture of surprise and something else, perhaps hope. I'll be damned, I read about what you did tonight. It's already hitting the financial news wires. The waitress who became a queen. I always knew there was more fight in your family's blood than they gave you credit for. Akari felt a small, genuine smile form on her lips. It's not over, David, she said, her voice firm. Getting rid of Thorne was just the first step. He didn't just outmaneuver my father. I believe he broke the law to do it. The hostile takeover was too clean, too fast. There were financial irregularities that the SEC overlooked, key board members who folded under suspicious circumstances. I want to prove it. I want to expose the entire rotten foundation he built his career on. I have the resources now, but I need your help. I need your mind, your instincts. Another silence stretched between them, but this one was different. It was filled with the hum of possibilities, the awakening of an old journalistic fire. Thorne was never just a corporate shark, David said, his voice losing its weary edge and taking on a sharper, more focused tone. He was a predator who surrounded himself with other predators. To go after him for the takeover, you're not just digging up a 10-year-old corporate file. You're poking a hornet's nest of white-collar criminals, powerful people who have a lot to lose if that story ever sees the light of day. Are you truly prepared for that kind of fight? This is more dangerous than a public confrontation in a restaurant. He was testing her, making sure she understood the stakes. He was no longer speaking to the grieving daughter of his friend, but to a potential ally in a war he had been forced to abandon years ago. I've spent the last 10 years of my life living a lie, David, Akari responded, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. I sacrificed everything. My name, my career, my youth, for a single objective. I am not afraid of a fight. What I am afraid of is letting him get away with it. Justice isn't just about firing him. Justice is about revealing the truth, no matter how ugly or how dangerous it is. My father deserves that. Every employee he ever mistreated deserves that. I want to build a company on a foundation of integrity, and to do that I have to first excavate and expose all the poison that Thorne buried beneath it. Will you help me? The question hung in the air, a formal invitation to step back into the ring. She wasn't just offering him a chance to settle an old score. She was offering him a chance to finish the most important story of his life. A low chuckle came through the phone, a sound of rust being scraped away from an old, powerful engine. Akari, David Chen said, and for the first time she could hear the brilliant, relentless investigative reporter he once was. I've been waiting for this phone call for 10 years. Meet me tomorrow morning, my office, 7 a.m. sharp. We have a decade of dirt to dig up, and we'd better get started. Thorne might be out of a job, but men like him don't just disappear. They have contingency plans, buried secrets, and powerful friends. Our work is just beginning. The line went dead, but Akari stood on the bridge, the phone still pressed to her ear, a feeling of profound relief and fierce determination washing over her. She was no longer alone. She had an ally. The quest for revenge was over, but the crusade for justice had just begun. The path forward was no longer a vast, empty unknown, but a clearly defined battlefield. She finally hailed a cab, the exhaustion she felt earlier replaced by a surge of focused energy. As the taxi sped through the glittering canyons of Manhattan, her mind was already racing, formulating a strategy. David was right. Thorne would not go quietly. The public humiliation would make him desperate, and a desperate man with Thorne's resources was incredibly dangerous. He would try to destroy her reputation, lock down incriminating files, and intimidate potential witnesses. Her first move as chairwoman couldn't be a sweeping announcement of new corporate values. It had to be a strategic lockdown of all internal data. She needed to secure the servers, freeze all executive-level document shredding protocols, and get a forensic accounting team in place before Thorne's allies inside the company had a chance to cover their tracks. The battle for the soul of her father's company would be fought not in the boardroom, but in server rooms and forgotten filing cabinets. The next morning she arrived at David Chen's office, a cramped, dusty space above a bakery in Queens that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. It was a far cry from the opulent world of the Elysian Grand, but it felt more real, more purposeful. David was already there, a massive whiteboard cleared and waiting. He was older, grayer, but his eyes were sharp, alight with the thrill of the hunt. "Good, you're early," he grunted, gesturing towards the board. "I was up all night pulling my old notes, the takeover. It always smelled wrong." The key was a company called Viridian Capital, a ghost entity. It bought up a critical block of shares a week before the takeover vote, then dissolved a month later. The money trail went cold in the Cayman Islands. If we can find out who was behind Viridian, we find Thorne's conspiracy. For hours they worked, the old journalist and the young financial prodigy. Akari's mind, trained to see patterns in complex financial data, found new life in David's old-school investigative techniques. She mapped out Thorne's network on the whiteboard, the board members who had inexplicably changed their votes, the auditors who had signed off on questionable reports, the rival executives who had benefited from the Tanaka Group's fall. David in turn provided the human context, the rumors, the off-the-record whispers he had collected a decade ago. He knew which board members had gambling debts, which ones had secrets that could be used as leverage. Together, they were building a map of Thorne's criminal enterprise, a web of greed and corruption that extended far beyond a single hostile takeover. It was becoming clear that Thorne hadn't just stolen a company. He had orchestrated a multi-layered conspiracy. Their first target became clear: Arthur Vance, the former chief financial officer of her father's company. Vance had been a trusted family friend, a man her father had treated like a brother. Yet he had been the one to cast the deciding vote that handed the company to Thorne. A week later, Vance had retired, citing health reasons, and moved to a private island in the Caribbean, far from the reach of subpoenas. He had been the ultimate betrayal, the wound from which her father had never recovered. Vance didn't just retire, David said, circling his name on the board with a red marker. He disappeared with a golden parachute worth at least $50 million, far more than his official severance package. That money had to come from somewhere. Find the source of Vance's payout, and you'll find the smoking gun that proves the takeover was fraudulent. The plan began to take shape, a multi-pronged assault on Thorne's carefully constructed empire of lies. Akari would use her new authority as chairwoman to launch an internal audit, a perfectly legitimate corporate action that would give her legal access to the company's financial archives. She would hire a team of the best forensic accountants in the country, people loyal only to her, to comb through a decade's worth of records, looking for the digital ghost of Viridian Capital. Meanwhile, David would use his old network of contacts, the disgruntled secretaries, the retired investigators, the journalists who owed him favors, to track Arthur Vance. He needed to find a way to get to Vance, to pressure him, to convince him to break his decade-long silence. It was a long shot, a dangerous gamble, but it was their only path to the truth. As she left David's office late that afternoon, Akari felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but it was a righteous one. She was no longer just a daughter seeking vengeance for her father's death. She was the leader of a movement to restore honor and integrity to a broken corporate culture. Her fight was not just against one man, but against the system of greed and impunity that had allowed him to thrive. She walked back into the city, not as a ghost in the shadows, but as a force of nature, ready to unleash a storm. The world knew her as the waitress who had toppled the CEO. They were about to learn that her true work, the work of rebuilding an empire on a foundation of truth, had only just begun. The first phase of her plan was complete, but the war for her family's soul was far from over. The following days were a whirlwind of calculated, strategic action. Akari's first official act as chairwoman was to call an emergency board meeting. She walked into the boardroom at the top floor of the Elysian Grand, the same room where her father had been betrayed, not in a waitress uniform, but in a sharply tailored suit that radiated quiet authority. The remaining board members, most of them Thorne's cronies, eyed her with a mixture of fear and suspicion. They were sharks, and they could smell blood in the water, but for the first time, they were not sure if it was hers or their own. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She announced an immediate, comprehensive, and independent forensic audit of the company's finances, stretching back 12 years. The announcement landed like a grenade in the silent room. Objections were raised, veiled threats were made about shareholder confidence and market stability. Akari met each objection with unshakable calm. Shareholder confidence is built on transparency, she stated, her voice cool and even. And market stability is impossible when a company's foundation may be compromised by historical irregularities. This audit is not a suggestion. It is a necessity for the future health of this corporation. Any attempt to obstruct this investigation will be interpreted as an admission of wrongdoing and will be dealt with accordingly. She had their full attention. The veiled threats ceased. She had used their own language, the cold, calculating jargon of corporate governance, to corner them. They could not publicly oppose an audit without implicating themselves. She had them trapped. The motion passed unanimously, their forced smiles doing little to hide the panic in their eyes. The hunt for Viridian capital had officially begun within the walls of the company itself. While her team of auditors began their digital excavation, Akari turned her attention to the human element of her father's company. She spent her days walking the floors of the hotel, not as a chairwoman making a grand tour, but as a colleague. She spoke to the housekeeping staff, the bellhops, the concierge, the kitchen staff. She learned their names, listened to their stories of working under Thorne's oppressive regime, stories of cut benefits, impossible workloads, and a pervasive culture of fear. She saw the quiet dignity and resilience in their eyes, the same spirit of *omotenashi* her father had cherished, a spirit that had survived despite years of being systematically crushed. These people were not cogs in a machine. They were the heart and soul of the company, and she knew that restoring the empire meant restoring their faith and their dignity first. Her actions sent ripples of change throughout the organization. She immediately reinstated the employee benefits program that Thorne had cut, including full health coverage and a pension plan. She established an anonymous channel for reporting grievances, ensuring that no employee would ever feel powerless again. Small changes, perhaps, in the grand scheme of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, but for the staff, they were monumental. They were a signal that the era of tyranny was over, and that the principles of Kenji Tanaka were being resurrected. A new sense of hope began to permeate the halls of the hotel, a quiet loyalty forming around the new, enigmatic leader who had once walked among them, unseen and underestimated. She was earning their trust not with speeches, but with actions, rebuilding her father's house one brick of human decency at a time. Meanwhile, David Chen was making progress on a darker front. After calling in every favor he was owed, he got a hit. A former colleague, now working for a private security firm, had located Arthur Vance. He wasn't living a life of quiet retirement. He was a virtual prisoner in his Caribbean mansion, surrounded by a security detail that was more like a team of guards. His communications were monitored, his movements restricted. David's source confirmed that the security team was on the payroll of a shell corporation that, after a few layers of obfuscation, traced back to a holding company controlled by none other than Marcus Thorne. Vance wasn't enjoying his golden parachute. He was a loose end that Thorne was keeping on a very short, very tight leash. He was the key to everything, but he was locked in a gilded cage. The information changed the entire dynamic of their investigation. It was no longer just about uncovering a past crime. It was about a present and ongoing conspiracy. Thorne was actively suppressing a key witness. This elevated the case from corporate fraud to potential witness tampering and obstruction of justice, crimes that carried serious prison sentences. Akari realized that Thorne was far more desperate and far more dangerous than she had even imagined. He wasn't just trying to protect his reputation, he was trying to stay out of jail. The stakes of their mission had just been raised exponentially. They were no longer just fighting for a company's legacy. They were fighting a cornered, ruthless criminal with everything to lose. The need to reach Vance became critical. A direct approach was impossible. They needed a way to get a message to him, to let him know that there was a way out, that a powerful new ally was ready to offer him protection in exchange for the truth. The plan they devised was risky, a delicate piece of spycraft that felt more suited to a thriller novel than a corporate investigation. David had a contact, a journalist known for her tenacity and her ability to get into places she wasn't wanted. She would travel to the island under the guise of writing a travel piece on exclusive resorts. Her real mission: to create a momentary distraction, a small window of chaos just large enough for a different operative to slip a secure, untraceable satellite phone past Vance's security detail. The tension in the following days was immense. Akari had to maintain the facade of a new CEO focused on corporate restructuring, attending endless meetings and reviewing financial projections, all while coordinating a clandestine operation thousands of miles away. Every encrypted message from David made her heart pound. The risks were enormous. If their operative was caught, Thorne would know they were coming for him, and he would likely move to silence Vance permanently. The life of the man who had betrayed her father was now ironically in her hands. She was caught in a moral labyrinth, forced to protect the very person whose treachery had started her on this path a decade ago. It was a cruel twist of fate, but she knew it was the only way to uncover the full extent of Thorne's villainy and finally bring true, complete justice to her father's memory. Finally, the message came, a single word from David, delivered. The satellite phone was in Arthur Vance's hands. The bait had been laid. Now, all they could do was wait and see if a man who had lived in fear for 10 long years still had enough courage left to make one final call for redemption. The first block of their development was complete, the investigation was in motion, the pieces were moving on the board, and the enemy was now aware that he was being hunted. The quiet war had begun, and Akari stood at its center, a commander who had traded her waitress apron for a suit of armor, ready for the next, more dangerous phase of the battle. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would dwarf the one in the dining room, a final reckoning that would expose a decade of lies to the harsh light of truth. The days that followed were a study in controlled tension, a quiet war fought on two fronts. By day, Akari was the picture of a new, transformative leader, her every public action measured and deliberate. She moved through the corporate headquarters with a serene confidence, her presence a calming balm on an organization still reeling from the shock of its leadership's implosion. She conducted meetings with divisional heads, her questions about supply chains and marketing strategies so insightful and precise that any lingering doubts about her capabilities were swiftly extinguished. She was rebuilding her father's empire with one hand, her mind parsing complex financial models and human resource policies. But by night, in the solitude of her penthouse apartment overlooking the sprawling, glittering expanse of New York City, she was a different person entirely. She was a hunter, A strategist, her focus narrowed to a single untraceable satellite phone that sat silently on her desk, a cold, dark monolith connecting her to a ghost on the other side of the world. Each hour that passed without a call stretched her nerves thinner, a silent, screaming tautness beneath her placid exterior. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that threatened to erode her carefully constructed composure. She had imagined this part of her journey as a series of decisive, powerful moves, a chess game where she was always 3 steps ahead. The reality was far more agonizing. It was a game of patience, a test of will against the crushing weight of silence. She would sit for hours, staring at the phone, replaying the confrontation in the dining room, analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for any mistake she might have made. Then her thoughts would drift to Arthur Vance, the man who had been a fixture of her childhood, a man she had called Uncle. She tried to reconcile the image of the warm, laughing man who had taught her how to ride a bicycle with the trader who had sold her father's soul for 30 pieces of silver, or in his case, $50 million. Was there anything left of that man to appeal to? Or was he a hollowed-out shell, a creature motivated only by a desperate, craven fear? The question haunted her through the long, sleepless nights, as the city lights blurred into a meaningless tapestry outside her window, and the satellite phone remained stubbornly, maddeningly silent, a sentinel guarding a past she desperately needed to unlock. David Chen provided a steadying, grounding force against the tide of her anxiety. He was her anchor to the real world, his gruff, no-nonsense updates a welcome antidote to her spiraling thoughts. He worked his own network with a relentless, old-school tenacity, piecing together fragments of information, building a mosaic of Thorne's network of corruption. He uncovered whispers of other hostile takeovers, other companies left in ruins, other executives who had been suspiciously enriched in the aftermath. Thorne, it became clear, was not a one-time offender. He was a serial corporate predator, and the destruction of the Tanaka Hospitality Group had been his masterpiece, the blueprint for a career built on ruin. This knowledge only hardened Akari's resolve. This was bigger than her family. It was about dismantling a machine of greed that had chewed up countless lives and spat them out. Her father was not Thorne's only victim. He was just the one whose daughter had found a way to fight back. The weight of this responsibility settled on her shoulders, pushing aside the personal anxiety and replacing it with a cold, clear sense of purpose. Then on the 5th night of waiting, when the silence had become a physical presence in the room, it happened. The satellite phone emitted a harsh, electronic chirp, a sound so alien and abrupt in the quiet of her apartment that it made her jolt as if struck by lightning. For a moment, she could only stare at it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hand trembled as she reached for the receiver, the cool plastic feeling strangely heavy, a conduit to a decade of betrayal and pain. She took a deep, steadying breath, the one she had taken just before confronting Thorne, and pressed the button to answer. She said nothing, letting the silence on the line stretch, forcing the man on the other end to be the first to speak, to be the one to break. The static on the line felt like the sound of ghosts whispering, the ghosts of the past 10 years of her life, all converging on this single, pivotal moment. A voice finally crackled through the receiver, thin and reedy, a pale imitation of the confident baritone she remembered. It was a voice stripped of all authority, frayed at the edges with a decade of paranoia and fear. Is this her?" the voice stammered, the words barely audible over the hiss of the connection. It was Arthur Vance. He sounded like a man speaking from the bottom of a well, a prisoner in a dungeon of his own making. Akari closed her eyes, picturing his face, the face of her father's betrayer. She felt a surge of cold fury, but she ruthlessly suppressed it. She needed him not as an object of her rage, but as a tool for justice. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, controlled, and utterly devoid of emotion. "This is Akari Tanaka," she said, each word a carefully placed stone. You knew my father, and you know why I am calling. It is time to tell the truth, Arthur. It is time to come home." A dry, rattling sob came through the phone. It was a sound of profound, soul-deep despair. "You don't understand," Vance whispered, his voice breaking. "He sees everything. He hears everything. These men who guard me, they're not for my protection. They're my jailers. If he even suspects I've spoken to you, I'm a dead man. He'll make it look like an accident. A boating mishap, a heart attack. He's capable of anything. You've made him desperate, you know. He's a cornered animal now, more dangerous than ever before." Akari listened, letting him pour out his fear. She needed to understand the landscape of his terror before she could offer him a path through it. She felt a flicker of something akin to pity for this broken man, a man so consumed by the consequences of his own greed that he had ceased to truly live a decade ago. He was a ghost long before he had ever picked up this phone. "I am not asking you to be brave, Arthur," Akari said, her tone softening slightly, shifting from command to persuasion. "I am offering you a choice. You can continue to live as Thorne's prisoner, waiting for the day he decides you are too great a liability to keep alive, or you can trust me to get you out. I have resources now that you cannot imagine. I can offer you protection. I can offer you a chance to clear your conscience. But you have to give me something in return. You have to give me the proof that Thorne orchestrated the takeover illegally. I know you have it. A man as meticulous as you would never have left his fate entirely in another man's hands. You would have created an insurance policy. I want that insurance policy, Arthur." There was another long silence on the line, this one filled not with fear but with a dawning, reluctant calculation. She had read him correctly. His betrayal had been born of weakness, but his survival had been orchestrated by a shrewd, self-preservationist intellect. "The package?" he finally breathed, the words almost a prayer. "I called it the package. A dead man's switch. Everything is in there. The original wire transfer records from Viridian Capital, showing the funds originating from a holding company directly linked to Thorne. Taped conversations with the 2 board members he blackmailed into changing their votes. A signed, notarized affidavit from me, detailing the entire conspiracy from beginning to end. It's my confession and his death sentence. I created it the week after the takeover, when I realized the kind of monster I had made a deal with." Akari's grip on the phone tightened. This was it, the smoking gun. The irrefutable proof that would not just end Thorne's career but would land him in a federal prison for the rest of his life. "Where is it, Arthur?" she asked, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "It's not here," he said quickly. "I'm not that foolish. It's safe. Somewhere he would never think to look. But getting it requires me to be there in person. The security protocols are biometric. My thumbprint, a retinal scan. I can't just give you a key." The pieces clicked into place in Akari's mind. It wasn't enough to get the evidence. She had to get the man. The key and the witness were one and the same. The mission had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more dangerous. She had to orchestrate a full-scale extraction. While Akari and David began to formulate the high-stakes plan to retrieve Vance, Marcus Thorne was not idle. The humiliation he had suffered had not broken him. It had forged his fear into a cold, diamond-hard resolve to survive. He was a master of corporate warfare, and he was now applying those skills to erasing his own past. From a temporary command center in a law office that specialized in crisis management, he initiated his counterattack. He couldn't fire Akari, but he could try to discredit her, to bury her in a mountain of legal challenges and shareholder lawsuits. He began seeding rumors in the financial press, painting her as a vengeful, unstable heiress on a personal vendetta, a loose cannon who was jeopardizing the company's stability. He was trying to poison the well, to turn the board and the investors against her before her audit could bear fruit. Simultaneously, he moved to cauterize his old wounds. He initiated a massive, company-wide, quote, data migration and security upgrade. It was a brilliant cover. Under the guise of protecting the company's digital assets, his loyalists in the IT department began a systematic purge. They shredded digital files, wiped old servers, and encrypted entire databases, burying the evidence of the Viridian Capital transaction under layers of impenetrable code. Akari's forensic accounting team, who had been making steady progress, suddenly hit a digital brick wall. Key servers were suddenly, quote, corrupted. Archive files were irretrievably lost. It was a scorched earth campaign, and Thorne was burning down the very history of the company to save himself. The clock was ticking louder than ever. Every day that passed, another piece of the truth was turned to digital ash. The news from the audit team was a blow, but it only strengthened Akari's conviction that extracting Vance was their only remaining path to victory. The plan they devised with David was audacious, something straight out of an espionage novel. It would be an operation of pure misdirection. They couldn't go in with force. Thorne's security on the island was too professional, too alert. They had to make Vance's disappearance look like anything but an extraction. They needed to create a window of chaos, a moment of confusion so complete that a man could simply vanish from a heavily guarded compound in broad daylight, leaving his jailers to believe he had met with an unfortunate and entirely plausible accident. The risks were astronomical, but the potential reward was the justice she had sought for a decade. The first phase of the operation was to sow the seeds of that chaos. David, using a secure, anonymous channel, leaked a tip to the island's local law enforcement, a carefully fabricated report about a major drug trafficking ring, using the secluded coves near Vance's property as a transfer point. The tip was detailed, credible, and specifically mentioned the likelihood of heavily armed participants. The goal was not to trigger a raid, but to put local authorities on high alert, to create a heightened state of tension and scrutiny around the entire area. Thorne's security detail, no matter how professional, would now have to contend with an unpredictable external variable. They would be watching the sea, not just for rescuers, but for drug runners and police patrols, their attention divided. The second phase involved the tenacious journalist who had delivered the phone. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, a woman who had made a career out of walking into hornets' nests. She would return to the island, this time not as a travel writer but as an aggressive investigative reporter. Her new, publicly declared story was an exposé on the environmental impact of unregulated mega-yacht tourism in the region. Her real mission was to get as close to Vance's compound as possible and, at a precisely coordinated moment, create a public, unavoidable, and highly disruptive scene. She would be the spark that ignited the carefully laid kindling of chaos, the bright, noisy distraction that would draw every eye, every guard, every security camera in her direction. The final piece of the puzzle was the extraction itself. A small, high-speed boat, manned by a former Special Forces operative David knew from his days as a war correspondent, would be waiting in a hidden cove on the far side of the island. Vance's instructions, delivered via a series of coded messages on the satellite phone, were simple and terrifying. When he heard the commotion from Sarah's manufactured incident, he was to trigger a minor, pre-planned electrical fault in his guest house, a small fire that would trip the alarms and add to the confusion. In the ensuing pandemonium, with his guards distracted by the journalist on one side and the fire on the other, he would have a window of no more than 90 seconds to slip out through a pre-arranged breach in the compound's perimeter fence and make a desperate sprint for the cove. The day of the operation arrived, a bright, clear Caribbean morning that felt grotesquely cheerful given the life-and-death drama about to unfold. Akari sat in a darkened room in New York, a makeshift command center she had set up with David. They had a live satellite feed of the island and a secure communication link to the boat operator. She watched the pixels on the screen, her hands clenched into fists, her entire body rigid with tension. She felt a profound sense of unreality, as if she were watching a movie rather than directing a real-world operation where a single misstep could get people killed. The fate of her life's mission, the culmination of 10 years of struggle, now rested on the courage of a broken man and the flawless execution of a plan that had 1,000 ways to go wrong. Then it began. Sarah Jenkins, feigning a boat engine failure, deliberately ran her small rental craft aground on the rocks near Vance's private beach. She emerged, shouting and waving her arms, a picture of distress. As Thorne's guards cautiously approached, she launched into her performance. She began screaming about corporate negligence, about billionaires destroying pristine coral reefs, her voice amplified by a small, hidden bullhorn. She was loud, obnoxious, and utterly impossible to ignore. 2 of the 4 guards were immediately drawn to her, trying to contain the situation and get her off the property. The satellite feed showed them arguing with her, their attention completely fixed on the furious, camera-wielding journalist who refused to back down. Seconds later, a thin plume of smoke began to rise from the guest house on the far side of the compound. The fire alarm began to blare, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the tropical air. The remaining 2 guards, their faces etched with alarm, broke off and sprinted towards the building, shouting into their radios. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the compound was in total disarray. It was the window. On the screen, Akari saw a figure, small and indistinct, dart from behind the guest house. It was Vance. He ran with a desperate, stumbling gait, a man who had not run in years, fueled by pure terror and a final, flickering spark of hope. He scrambled through the gap in the fence and disappeared into the dense tropical foliage that lined the path to the sea. The next 2 minutes were the longest of Akari's life. The satellite feed couldn't see through the thick canopy of trees. There was only silence on the comms link. She could only stare at the screen, her breathing shallow, her mind filled with 1,000 horrifying possibilities. Had he fallen? Had a guard spotted him? Was Thorne's security team already closing in on him? Then, a voice crackled in her ear, the calm, steady voice of the boat operator. "Package is aboard." "I repeat, the package is aboard. We are clear of the island." A wave of relief so powerful it was physically debilitating washed over Akari. She sagged back in her chair, her body trembling, the strength draining from her limbs. They had done it. They had pulled the ghost from his prison. They brought Vance to a secure, undisclosed location, a quiet, safe house in rural Canada that David had maintained for years. When Akari saw him in person for the first time in over a decade, she was shocked. The robust, confident man from her memories was gone, replaced by a gaunt, haunted figure with gray skin and eyes that seemed permanently wide with fear. He was a man utterly broken by guilt and paranoia. He wept as he saw her, a torrent of confession and apology pouring out of him. He told her everything. He detailed how Thorne had discovered his secret gambling debts and used them as leverage, threatening to ruin him not just financially, but to send him to prison for embezzlement. He had been trapped, he explained, with no way out. He described the immense pressure, the threats against his family, the way Thorne had systematically isolated him from her father, feeding him lies to create a rift between the 2 old friends. He confessed that casting the final vote to sell the company was the single act that had shattered his soul, a moment of betrayal he had relived in his nightmares every single night for the past 10 years. He was a man drowning in his own regret, and Akari found, to her surprise, that the burning hatred she had harbored for him for so long had been replaced by a cold, profound pity. He was not a monster like Thorne. He was a weak man who had made a monstrous choice, and he had been living in a hell of his own making ever since. He was a casualty of the war, another life ruined in Thorne's relentless pursuit of power. After his emotional confession was complete, his demeanor shifted. A flicker of the old, meticulous CFO returned to his eyes. He was ready to complete his end of the bargain. "The package," he said, his voice now steady. "It's not in a bank vault under my name. That would have been too obvious. It's in Geneva, at the Crédit Fédéral de Genève. The safety deposit box is registered to a shell corporation under a name my father used in the 1960s. A name Thorne would have no way of ever knowing. The contents are legally bound to the corporation, not to me personally." He reached into his shoe and pulled out the insole. Taped to the bottom was a small, flat, intricately designed brass key. He laid it on the table between them. It was old, ornate, and felt heavy with the weight of the secrets it protected. He then wrote down a name, a box number, and a series of access codes on a piece of paper. "This key, combined with my biometrics, will get you into the vault," he explained. "But this information," he said, pushing the paper towards her, "will give you legal ownership of the Shell Corporation's assets. With this, you don't just have the evidence. You have legal, undeniable title to it. It can be entered into any court in the world." Akari picked up the key, its cold metal a tangible link to the past, a final key to unlock the truth. She looked from the key in her hand to the broken man in front of her, and then to the piece of paper containing the codes. She had it all: the witness, the confession, the key, the irrefutable proof. The war of shadows was over. All that remained was the final, public execution. The stage was now fully set for a checkmate that would echo from Wall Street to Tokyo. Her plan for the final confrontation was no longer a hope. It was a certainty. The venue for the final act of this decade-long drama could not have been more fitting. Akari chose the Grand Ballroom of the Elysian Grand for the annual Thorn International Hospitality Shareholders Meeting. It was a space designed for coronations and triumphs, a cavernous hall with ceilings so high they seemed to capture and hold the very echoes of power. This was Thorn's stage, the place where he, for 10 years, had performed his mastery of the universe to a captive audience of investors and sycophants. Now it would be the theater of his undoing. In the days leading up to the meeting, Akari was a study in serene focus. She was no longer the ghost in the machine, nor the avenging angel. She had synthesized her identities into something new, something formidable. She was the chairwoman, the rightful heir, and she spent her hours not just with her legal team, meticulously choreographing the presentation of evidence, but in quiet contemplation. She reviewed her father's old journals, rereading his passages on the soul of hospitality, on the sacred trust between a host and a guest. She was not preparing for a battle. She was preparing to deliver a eulogy for a corrupt era and a coronation for a new one, a restoration of her family's most deeply held beliefs. She was calm, not because she was certain of victory, but because she was certain of her purpose, a purpose that now transcended revenge, and had settled into the much heavier, more profound mantle of justice and reconstruction. The atmosphere in the ballroom on the day of the meeting was thick with a palpable, electric tension. The air, usually filled with the confident hum of wealth, was instead charged with the static of uncertainty. Over 500 of the world's most influential investors, bankers, and industry analysts filled the plush velvet chairs, their faces a gallery of guarded curiosity. Rumors had been swirling for weeks, a tempest in the insulated world of high finance. The sudden, brutal ousting of a titan like Marcus Thorne by an unknown waitress, the subsequent internal audit, the whispers of a deeper, darker story. It was the kind of drama that Wall Street both feared and secretly savored. Thorne himself was present, a dark, thunderous cloud in a bespoke suit. He sat in the front row, flanked by his lawyers, projecting an aura of defiant arrogance. It was a desperate, transparent performance. He intended to use this meeting to paint Akari as a reckless, emotionally compromised amateur, to stage a coup and reclaim his throne. When Akari entered from a side door, the room fell into a sudden, profound hush. She walked alone, her steps measured and silent on the deep-piled carpet. She wore a simple, elegant, dark blue dress, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. She radiated not aggression, but an unassailable authority, a quiet power that needed no announcement. She was the calm at the center of the storm she had created. Akari took her place at the podium, adjusting the microphone with a steady hand. She looked out over the sea of powerful faces, her gaze sweeping past Marcus Thorne without a flicker of acknowledgement. Her speech began not with financials or projections, but with a story. She spoke of her father, Kenji Tanaka, not as a vanquished CEO, but as a visionary, an artist whose medium was hospitality. She spoke of omotenashi explaining it not as a business strategy, but as a philosophy, a profound and sacred commitment to anticipating and fulfilling the needs of others with grace and sincerity. For the last decade, she said, her voice clear and resonant, filling every corner of the vast room, this company has been expertly managed to maximize short-term profit. It has become a model of efficiency. But in that pursuit, it has lost its soul. A balance sheet can tell you the price of everything, but it cannot tell you the value of a single thing. It cannot measure honor. It cannot quantify integrity. And it is the absence of these values that has led us here today. She then detailed the launch of the forensic audit, describing how her teams had encountered a labyrinth of digital firewalls, corrupted servers, and irretrievably lost data, all dating back to the period of the hostile takeover. It was a scorched earth campaign, she stated, her eyes finally landing on Thorne, a desperate attempt to burn down the past. But some truths, once written, can never be erased. Some ghosts refuse to stay buried. The digital records may have been compromised, Akari continued, her voice dropping to a lower, more dramatic register, but the human record is far more resilient. At her signal, a door at the side of the stage opened. Arthur Vance walked out, blinking in the bright stage lights. A wave of audible gasps and frantic whispers swept through the ballroom. This was a man presumed to be living in luxurious exile, a ghost from a decade-old corporate battle. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were clear, his posture straight. He was no longer the terrified prisoner from the safe house. He was a man on a final, desperate mission for redemption. He took a seat in a chair placed beside the podium, and in a steady, somber voice, he delivered his confession to the world. He told them everything: the gambling debts, the blackmail, the threats from Thorne, the immense pressure that led to his ultimate betrayal of Kenji Tanaka. Marcus Thorne didn't just buy a company, Vance said, his voice cracking with emotion. He bought my soul. And I have spent 10 years in a prison of my own making, paying the price for it. Then he spoke of the insurance policy, the package that he had created as his only hope for survival. As he spoke, the massive screen behind the stage, previously displaying the company logo, flickered to life. What appeared on the screen was not a spreadsheet or a corporate video, but the cold, hard architecture of a crime. First, the scanned images of the wire transfer confirmations from Viridian Capital, with expert annotations showing the clear, undeniable money trail leading back to a shell corporation wholly owned by Marcus Thorne. Next, the full, notarized text of Vance's affidavit, a detailed, 30-page account of the conspiracy, signed and dated just 2 weeks after the takeover. And then came the final, devastating blow. Akari played the audio. The hushed, grainy sound of a secret recording filled the ballroom. It was Thorne's voice, younger, but filled with the same arrogant venom, systematically laying out his threats to another board member. "You have a choice." Thorne's voice echoed through the silent hall. "You can vote with Tanaka, and I can guarantee the world will find out about your little indiscretion in Zurich. Or you can vote with me, and you'll be a very, very wealthy man. The choice is simple." Akari let the recording play, let his own words, his own corruption hang in the air like a toxic fog. There was nowhere for him to hide. He was being condemned by the ghost of his own voice, his crimes laid bare for the entire world to witness. The silence in the room was absolute, the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. The transformation of Marcus Thorne was a horrifying spectacle. As the evidence mounted, his mask of defiant arrogance began to crack and then shatter completely. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. A sheen of cold sweat beaded on his forehead. His eyes, wide with a mixture of disbelief and primal terror, darted around the room, searching for an ally, an escape, but finding only a sea of cold, accusatory stares. The men and women he had once commanded, The peers he had dominated were now his judges and his jury. When the audio recording of his own voice filled the room, a strangled, inhuman sound escaped his lips. The last vestiges of his control snapped. He leaped to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. "Lies!" he screamed, his voice raw and shrill with panic. "It's all lies! A fabrication! She's a vindictive child trying to ruin me. This is a conspiracy." But his denials were hollow, drowned out by the damning echo of his own recorded voice. His tirade devolved into incoherent sputtering as two men in dark suits, who had been standing discreetly near the exit, began to move purposefully down the center aisle. They were not hotel security. Their jackets were cut to conceal firearms, their movements economical and precise. They were federal agents. They flanked him, and one of them spoke in a low, calm voice that was somehow more terrifying than Thorne's shouting. "Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice." His collapse was instantaneous and absolute. The titan of industry, the master of the universe, simply deflated, his body sagging as if his very bones had dissolved. He was no longer a predator. He was just a common criminal, caught and caged. As the federal agents placed him in handcuffs and led his trembling, unresisting form from the ballroom, the room remained in a state of stunned silence. The sheer, brutal finality of his downfall was a sight no one present would ever forget. The reporters in the back of the room were the first to recover, their phones and cameras suddenly aloft, a frantic digital chorus capturing the final, pathetic moments of Thorne's reign. Akari stood at the podium, a solitary, unwavering figure of calm in the swirling vortex of chaos. She watched him go, not with triumph, not with hatred, but with a profound and solemn sense of closure. The war was over. The ghost of her father had finally been laid to rest. Justice, true and complete, had been served not in the shadows, but in the brightest, most unforgiving of spotlights, for the entire world to see. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated catharsis, the culmination of a decade of pain, sacrifice, and unyielding resolve. The waitress had not just fired her boss, she had dismantled his entire corrupt universe, piece by painstaking piece, until nothing was left but the ugly, exposed truth. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Akari Tanaka finally exposed the truth for the entire world to see. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind of reconstruction. With the cancer of Thorne's regime excised, the company began to heal. The shareholder meeting ended with a unanimous, thunderous vote of confidence in Akari's leadership. The investor from the restaurant, a man named Hiroshi Sato, became one of her most vocal supporters and a key member of her new board. Her first official act was to restore the company's original name, the Tanaka Hospitality Group. The name itself was a declaration of intent, a promise to return to the values that had been so brutally discarded. She didn't just change the letterhead, she began to fundamentally reshape the corporate culture from the ground up. She promoted from within, identifying and elevating employees who had kept the spirit of *Omotenashi* alive during the dark years. A veteran bellman with 30 years of service was made the new manager of guest relations at the Elysian Grand. A talented line cook was sent to Le Cordon Bleu in Paris to become a head chef. She established the Kenji Tanaka Foundation, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to providing scholarships for underprivileged students seeking careers in hospitality, ensuring her father's legacy would nurture generations to come. The company, once a symbol of ruthless corporate greed, began to transform into a beacon of ethical business, proving that profitability and principle were not mutually exclusive. The final scene of Akari's long journey was not one of public triumph, but of quiet personal peace. Months after the shareholder meeting, she found herself walking through the rooftop garden of the Elysian Grand, a serene oasis of cherry blossoms and meticulously raked gravel that her father had designed himself. It was late at night, and the city sprawled beneath her, a silent, glittering carpet of light. She was no longer fueled by the burning fire of vengeance. That fire had been quenched, replaced by the warm, steady glow of purpose. She had not just reclaimed a company, she had reclaimed her own life from the shadow of her grief. She had learned that justice was not about the destruction of an enemy, but about the creation of something better in his place. She had honored her father not by destroying the man who killed him, but by resurrecting the dream he had dedicated his life to building. Her journey from a silent, grieving daughter to an undercover waitress to a celebrated visionary leader was complete. She had proven that a legacy built on honor, integrity, and wholehearted service was infinitely more powerful and enduring than any empire built on a foundation of greed. She had found her own version of *omotenashi*, not just in serving guests, but in serving the memory of her father and the future of the world he had loved. If Akari Tanaka's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.